This video is going to be talking through the sources that discuss Gaius or Caligula's religious policy. So we have four different authors. We have a bit of Suetonius, some Josephus, younger Seneca, and Cassius Dio. So the previous video talked about how when Gaius came to the throne, everything was really positive and everyone's really happy and everything's really exciting. And you're going to start to see a change in the tone quite quickly. So for example, the very first sentence of the Suetonius source, so much for the emperor, the rest of this history must deal with the monster. Kind of sets it up quite nicely about what happens under Gaius's rule. Like I said, things start to fall apart quite quickly. The story is that he was fine, and then he became ill with quite a serious illness. Obviously, that's why he's ill. No one knows what it was. And then when he emerged from this illness, he was completely different character. And this is seen as the point where he becomes quite literally insane. And there's lots of behaviours associated with this second half, well, not even half, second 3/4 of his rule, where that sort of demonstrate the fact that he had become seriously mentally unwell. Part of this is going to be his religious policy, and you're going to see there's going to be quite a big difference between the sort of things he was doing and what Tiberius and what Augustus had been doing before him. So it talks about him having a variety of titles that he'd given himself. None of these are particularly exciting. What sort of comes forward is in this section here. So what he starts to do is starts to act more like a king. So he sort of nearly assumes a royal diadem. So he takes the crown, turning the semblance of a principate into an autocracy. So suggesting that he was turning the emperorship into a kingship. But let's be honest, emperorship is pretty much the same thing anyway. But I think the point Suetonius is making is Augustus and Tiberius tried to have that balance between the emperor having power and the Senate having power, and under Gaius that balance completely is thrown out of the window. So he sort of starts acting very strangely, so he insisted on being treated as a god. So you've got famous statues of the Greek deities having their heads replaced by his own. So he's quite literally putting up statues of himself as the gods. This is quite a sharp change from the religious policy of Augustus. I think we would all agree. He then extends the palace as far as the forum, and he sort of takes in a couple of shrines and then stands between these divine brethren to worshipped by all visitants. So when people went to visit the palace, they had to worship Gaius as they entered. He establishes shrines to himself as a god. He has some priests, and he builds a life-size golden image of himself. It sort of talks about here, hang on, I've highlighted actually, that the Senate tries to gain priesthoods here because they also want to try and keep him on their side. There's lots of sacrifices offered, and these are quite extravagant animals. So you've got flamingos and peacocks, etc. This story would come a couple of times. He invited the moon goddess to have sex with him in his bed, as you do. And then he sort of starts challenging Jupiter, saying, he's more powerful than him and that you should obey me, not yourself. You're getting a gist of what Gaius was getting up to. And then there's this really weird story in 33 where he sort of plays a prank, in inverted commas, on this guy here, where he basically asks him a trick question. This guy sort of is unable to answer straight away, so he then starts having him whipped, and then it says commenting on the musical quality of his groans for mercy. It's not what I would call a prank. That just sounds like torture, but okay. But it kind of shows he obviously has this unlimited power. He can do whatever he wants. He sort of talks about him kissing his wife or mistress and sort of saying, I could cut the throat whenever I want. It gives you a measure of the kind of the character of Gaius. So if you want to highlight stuff in here, you can do. Because I'm focusing mostly on religion, I've not bothered, but it does show you kind of what he was like. We then have a new source author that we've not, hence why he's new, I don't know what I was going to say there, a guy called Josephus. So he writes from a Jewish perspective on the empire. So Judea, which is now sort of around Israel area, was the main centre of Jewish people under the Roman Empire. They were a client kingdom, but obviously under Roman control, and they were pretty unhappy about the situation because they were treated quite badly by various different emperors. Remember, Tiberius, for example, had expelled the Jews from Rome. Other emperors had even more forceful behaviour, sort of anti-Semitic behaviour towards them. and there were a couple of revolts in Judea, not ones that we particularly look at, but Josephus is a Jewish writer, and he's writing from this particular perspective. So that he doesn't particularly like the emperors. It's an understatement. And so he's using examples that show that these emperors were really corrupt and horrible and all the rest of it and ungodly. So this is where this source is talking through. So he talks about his own deification was his next step. So he wants to be honoured as a god. So he visited the temple of Jupiter and he addressed the god as his own brother. He also claims, this is Gaius, that he was lord of the ocean. And because of that, it means that he shouldn't sail across the sea. He should ride across the sea. So he builds a bridge 4 miles long to link two camps, which are the two coasts, which is Campania and Misenum. And then once he built the bridge, he rode across it in his chariots because that's what gods do. Go figure. Another part of his religious policy was that he also plundered loads of temples and took all the gold. So he says here there was not a temple in Greece, so he left them plundered. With all this material he looted from Greece, he adorned his palace and gardens. So he was quite sort of taking out everything, painting, sculptures, any offerings, etc., melted down silver, etc., sold off paintings and sculptures, or he just put up the paintings and sculptures in his own palace. So this is not a particularly religiously pious guy. He just does whatever he wants to do because he's a god. I mean, if he wants to go into temples and take this stuff, he's allowed to. I mean, he's the brother of Jupiter. So you've got to keep this in mind in terms of Gaius' kind of mental state at this particular point. There's a little bit of story about an architect who refused to do what he wanted to do, what Gaius once told him to steal a statue of Zeus. But fortunately, Gaius dies before the other guy's killed. So not a particularly exciting story, hence why I've not highlighted it. He also claims that he had a daughter. So he didn't claim he had a daughter. He had a daughter, and he claimed that she was the child of himself and Jupiter. Okay. I don't know what else to say. It's all very self-explanatory, this stuff, which is quite nice. And then we have younger Seneca, who was... Oh, hang on a second. Make sure I get my history right. Just double check my notes, because I just paused. Not that you can hear the pause, but I had to pause to double check. Yes, younger Seneca was... the tutor of the Emperor Nero, and he was dismissed after a while. We'll talk about when we do Nero. So he has kind of first experience of the emperors. He was well inside the imperial family. So he writes a series of different kind of essays about different emotional things or states of mind, so on and so forth. So he writes this one on consolation, to a guy called Polybius. And the first bit we don't need to really worry about. We do know that Gaius, so that's Caligula, lost his sister, and he becomes overwhelmed by grief here. And younger Seneca has a bit of a dig at him, saying that he, instead of showing his grief in a normal way, he was doing lots of gambling. Obviously, if you're upset, you do some things sometimes a bit self-destructive, but that's sort of like a description of him. What we do have is a nice good quote here, which I didn't highlight. What a disgrace to our empire that is its emperor. So he sort of doesn't like him at all. And then he talks about he had an inconsistency born of madness, and he gives you some examples of that. So, for example, he sometimes let his hair grow out and beard grow out, and then he shaved it off, which is clearly a sign of madness to the Romans. To be fair, I should point out the Romans tended to be very clean-shaven and very neat and tidy, and you only grew out your beard if you were in a state of mourning. So the fact that he would grow out his beard in the state of mourning would be fine, but then to shave it off next time and then regrow it is seen as being a bit inconsistent and a bit strange. He also says that he was unable to make up his mind whether he wanted his sister to be mourned as a mortal or worshipped as a goddess, but he decides to set up temples and shrines to her memory. So again, part of his religious policy, this is quite literally the imperial family being worshipped as gods. Obviously Gaius is having it done while he's actually alive, which is unusual, and not really part of the imperial cult that Augustus has set up. And then he's promoting the fact that his family should be worshipped as a god or goddess after they had died. And then we have this section of Cassius Dio. So you've got people started calling him a demigod, so that's part god, part man, and even a god. He went completely out of his mind. I don't think I need to explain that any further. Some stories we've come across before. So he kept declaring he was having sex with Luna, the moon goddess. He was pretending he was Jupiter. He claimed to be Neptune, which is when he built that really big bridge. He often appeared as Juno, Diana, or Venus. And he would attend meetings, which is what this bit is talking about, sometimes dressed up as the gods or goddesses, and would be expected to be addressed by that god or goddess's name. Again, it says to be clean shaven and then bearded, so on and so forth. He appeared to be shaking a trident, another brandishing a thunderbolt. We'll highlight that because it's quite amusing. So he literally is playing dress up as the gods and goddesses, and as I said, wants to be retreated the same. He wanted to appear more than just a human being and an emperor. He is a living god. That is his policy. There's a weird story here about someone from Gaul turned up, and Gaius was dressed as Jupiter, and the Gaul was just like, what on earth is going on? Gaius talks and says, what do you think of me? And he says, you're just a joke. And then he's sent away and nothing happens to him because he's just like a poor person who Gaius didn't seem particularly bothered. So again, it's not what you'd expect an emperor to be doing. Whenever he was pretending to be God, prayers, sacrifice would be offered to him as he thought fit. He expected to be treated as a god. It's certainly an extension of the imperial cult, I guess. Not sure it's what Augustus aimed for when he established the imperial cult and the way it was worshipped. But take from it what you will. Obviously, this does seem to happen after this very serious illness. There's definitely a change in his behaviour from being quite kind of calm and sort of normal, inverted commas, whatever normal means. There's no such thing as normal. To this, let's be honest, quite a raving, strange character. Yeah. Hopefully you've understood the basics of his religious policy, certainly around the imperial cult.